Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Aaron Chuey, a psychologist from Stanford University who recently published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences journal called Epistemic Language in News Headlines Shapes Readers' Perceptions of Objectivity. Hi, Aaron. Perhaps you could start by explaining a little bit about what that title means and how the research came about.
What we were initially interested in is what's called epistemic language, which is just how we talk about things like beliefs and knowledge. So these are verbs like think and believe and know and understand. And these are often used to frame content in headlines in the news. Often you'll hear things like, scientists believe that methane levels are rising, or, scientists now understand that, I don't know, there are 3 species of emperor penguins instead of 4, something like that. And so we were interested in how different kinds of epistemic language affect not just what people believe is true by reading a headline, but whether they think the matter at stake is a matter of fact or opinion, whether it's sort of an objective matter that has a ground truth or is something more subjective that, the ground truth is a little more illusory.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so what did your investigation uncover?
Yeah, so we found that, there are kind of 2 sorts of epistemic verbs. There's a kind of epistemic verb that sort of frames something as a belief. So these are like to believe, to think. And we find that when headlines frame content with those kinds of verbs, people think its content is more subjective. So if you say have a headline like, tortoise breeders believe tortoises are becoming more popular pets, and you ask people, do you think there's like an objective ground truth to whether or not tortoises are becoming more popular pets? People are more likely to say, no, it's sort of a more subjective issue when you frame it as tortoise breeders believe or think, compared to if you frame it as tortoise breeders know or understand that tortoises are becoming more popular pets. And we find this both for sort of these silly artificial headlines that people probably don't have strong prior beliefs about, but also real headlines about climate change. So people are also more likely to think that climate change and climate change related phenomena is a more subjective issue that doesn't have a ground truth when it's framed as something like scientists believe X about climate change, or the UN believes X about climate change.
Do you have any thoughts on why journalists and other people writing about, research or science or whatever it might be, have a tendency to use that kind of epistemic vague language around belief and think rather than know and understand and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't want to claim that science is like a sort of, it's a moving thing. It's changing, and, we don't always know what the ground truth is. And as a scientist, I'm not trying to claim that we should always be talking definitively about scientific findings. I think verbs like think and believe sort of express some level of uncertainty, which is often fair. So I also don't want to claim that, journalists should always use know and understand when talking about objective matters. It's more complicated than that. But I do think that journalists should think a little bit about how to balance the various goals that they're trying to convey. So, if you want to convey that an issue is an objective issue, maybe there's a way to still use a verb like know or understand while still conveying that, hey, this finding is maybe not the end all be all. So, I think that these sorts of verbs like believe and think are often sort of used to convey this kind of uncertainty, but with it also comes potentially like the idea that this is maybe not an objective issue at stake. This is maybe a bit more subjective, and actually nobody can know for sure, like in theory. And that's sort of the trouble.
That's interesting, because I've spoken in the past with a researcher called Sander van der Linden, who's done work about expressing uncertainty, and I think the research that his group at Cambridge did found that people, they respond quite well when uncertainty, when it's expressed that something is uncertain. But I guess in this case, it's important to express which the uncertain bits are and which aren't, and to be clear about what is and isn't sort of subjective or objective. Is that's sort of the gist?
Yeah, I think that's the idea. And I mean, epistemic language has lots of properties. Like I'm sure it, even though we didn't find, for example, that the epistemic language affected whether people believed that the headline itself was true or not, um, in a conversational context, so not with headlines, but just sort of if you're reasoning about what people are saying in a conversation, it certainly does have these kind of effects. So, I think that epistemic language can sort of do all kinds of things, and this is just one of the things that it can do. So, certainly this is sort of more like one issue that journalists should take into account among sort of many that they're trying to balance. Things like uncertainty, also novelty. Often sort of certain epistemic language just sounds sort of weird. For example, it sounds kind of weird to say scientists know that methane levels are rising. Like that seems very definitive and a little odd. Whereas something like scientists now understand that methane levels are rising sounds a little bit more reasonable. There's sort of this story there about, there was like, sort of a lack of knowledge before and something changed. And so there's a lot of subtlety to this. And so, this is really just one piece of a broader puzzle. But I do think it's an important piece because if you think about people reading headlines over and over and over again with this kind of language, like we find effects where people just read one headline. You can imagine people are scrolling on their phones through many, many headlines. They're usually not reading beyond it. And over time, we think that that can kind of slowly erode their belief in the objectivity of some of this phenomena. And if you think a phenomena is subjective, then it becomes less amenable to evidence. Then it's sort of like, nah, it's not an issue that has a ground truth. So maybe I'll base my belief on like what my group thinks is right and wrong.
Absolutely. And so it feels like the onus at the moment is on the journalists to, to consider better what language they're using. But I guess, in the reality of the situation, journalists have got a lot on their plate, just getting the stories out and in a form that they think people are going to engage with and read. So is there anything that kind of research institutes themselves perhaps could be doing to help them? I don't know, in terms of wording on press releases or guidance about which bits are more sort of solid foundational sort of science and which bits are a bit more open to interpretation?
Yeah, what's interesting, so, a lot of the work has so far been on what I'll call the consumer side. So a lot of this has been about, how do we make it so that people are sort of more responsible consumers? How can we harness people's, say cognitive abilities or biases to actually sort of learn for the better? But I'll be honest, a lot of this work, I have sort of a pessimistic read of a lot of this literature. Like even when you find something promising, the effect sizes are really tiny and often hard to institute in practice. So the amount of work that's been done on sort of the journalist side, especially when it comes to things like this, really there's not a lot. As far as I know, this is some of the first work to even look at objectivity as a concept that, sort of journalists, have some sort of influence over. So as far as I know, there's not really any good compilation of work that makes these kind of recommendations. And even from my background, I'm actually a developmental psychologist. So a lot of what I study is children and how children think about knowledge and belief. And so, this is sort of even a new area for me, thinking about, okay, not just because in a way, like one reason I got interested in this topic is, news media is something we didn't evolve to think about or consume, right? It's a really new sort of communicative tool. And so in a way, like we're all kind of like children when we consume it. It's something that's relatively new and that, often sort of evolves in new ways with consuming it on social media and consuming it, at sort of this really rapid pace. And so I sort of got interested in how adults think about this. And so I actually think that there's not many resources for journalists from this perspective of how is this sort of language affecting people. And again, I'm sure it affects people in other ways too, beyond whether they think something is objective or subjective. You can also probably measure things like, do they think that it's, a politically partisan issue? Do they think it's sort of a novel issue? Or do they think that this is an issue, that maybe could be false or, could change over time? So I think that there's sort of a number of, I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is a ripe area for research, and I hope more people do this work. and are able to give better recommendations. But unfortunately, I don't really know of any good place that journalists can go to for these kinds of recommendations right now.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Aaron. It's been really interesting hearing more about it. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.